Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Lupus LA for inviting me to be here today. It's really my pleasure. My name is Menaka Fernando. I am a partner at the employment law firm out in Golden, and I am an advocate for employees and workers' rights. I've been doing this work for the past 13 years. And I'm also a lupus patient. I was diagnosed with lupus at the age of 18. So I've been living with lupus for more than half my life, and which includes, navigating the workplace with lupus. So my hope today is not only to really give you an understanding of some of your protections under the law, but also to speak very practically about how to navigate the workplace when some medical issue or limitation arises because of your lupus. And because of my personal lens, I think I tend to see things a little differently than most lawyers, in that I totally get that, for most people, the goal is really just to do your job, right? And to figure out how to get the support of your employer when you're going through a flare or when some symptoms crop up. And you want to do your job, but also maintain your health, take care of your family. The last thing that you need, is a long legal fight with your employer to get into litigation. So, I get that, but I think it's also important really to be proactive and kind of understand what protections you do have, and ultimately to be an advocate for yourself, when issues arise in the workplace. So let's start with some basic things, right? Like, what are the laws that protect you? So since lupus is a disability, you are, and if you're an employee, you're protected under the federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and if you're in California, the Fair Employment and Housing Act. It's the general anti-discrimination statute that also has all of the provisions around disability discrimination and reasonable accommodation. Is all under the umbrella of that statute. But I also get that lupus is an invisible disability, right? You can go for years and years kind of hiding that pain, that fatigue. And, with me, people are usually surprised when I tell them, right? And they say things like, you have the good kind of disability, meaning like it doesn't affect my functioning, but the truth is that I'm really good at hiding it. And the pain, fatigue, headaches, kidney issues, doctor's visits, pregnancy complications, like you can hide that, but the truth of it is that it really does impact your functioning on a day-to-day basis. So the next question is, when do you take that step, right? And telling your employer about your lupus and that you have a medical condition that you might need accommodation for. And the answer, as in most legal questions, is that it depends. It really depends on your individual circumstances, right? Let's say you are in the interview process. Do you disclose that you have a medical condition or that you have lupus? And the answer really depends on whether you need an accommodation at the time that you start your job, right? Because legally, you have no obligation to disclose that you have a medical condition until you actually need an accommodation. And you never have an obligation to disclose your diagnosis. And, there might be practical reasons to do so, which I'll get into. But, in the hiring process, it's really a question of, do I need accommodation when I start this job? And then, then you kind of decide, does it make sense for me to disclose that I have a disability, that I need accommodation at this time? From a practical level, if you don't need that accommodation, maybe the hiring process is not the best time to disclose that you have a disability, because legal or not, obviously it's legal not to hire somebody because they shared that they have a disability. But that's really hard to prove. And, there's a lot of biases, prejudices that play into these decisions out there. And if your goal is to, get that job and you don't need an accommodation, managers might start thinking, look, are they going to go on leave as soon as they start? Like, is this person going to need a whole lot of accommodations that might end up being costly for the company? They're two equally qualified candidates. Maybe I'll go with the one that doesn't have a disability, right? Like, you don't know what's going through people's heads. You know, my kind of practical advice, even though all of those things that they're thinking about is unlawful, again, those things are hard to prove, and the reality is that it happens. So because I'm on the other end of it and I see those things happening, it might not be the best idea, you know, to disclose that in the hiring process unless you need an accommodation. Sometimes if you do need an accommodation, or, you know, even in the application process, it'll ask, do you need a reasonable accommodation? There you want to be truthful. You know, you don't want to hide that fact. You want to be truthful, and you want to share that, yes, I do need an accommodation. This is the accommodation that I need or I prefer. And then, you know, the employer is required to have a conversation about it with you. But, you know, kind of, you need to kind of think through your circumstances about if and when you want to disclose your disability, right? Now, once you start your employment, right, and maybe you then at that point you do want to share, like in the onboarding process, right? It would be pretty indicative of kind of unlawful motive if they hired you on and then you start the onboarding process and you tell HR, hey, I need an accommodation, and then the next thing is, oh, okay, we're going to withdraw that offer. That's, you know, that's pretty bad, and that's unlikely to happen, right? So maybe in the onboarding process is the better time to share with HR that, you know, you might need accommodation or you do have a medical condition, and they'll say, yeah, of course, no problem. You know, this is the process, something like that. Or you can wait until, you know, that need arises, right? You start feeling symptoms of a potential lupus flare coming, you know, or you're going through a very stressful time and, you know, you're in excess pain than normal, or you're starting to feel really fatigued, like towards the end of the day. So maybe that's the time, right? You start talking about the fact that you might need some accommodation. And then, you know, the next question is, who is it that you share this information with, right? HR is always a great place to go, right? In that they're supposed to be a resource for you for exactly these types of issues. And usually most employers will have a process in place and a practice in place. They have the forms for you to fill out if you need an accommodation. So certainly HR. I would say, you know, also on a practical level, and what I have done previously is usually I have the best relationship, or kind of the closest relationship, with my direct supervisors or direct managers, right? And so usually when I've gone through situations where I might need like a flexible schedule or need to take some time off because I'm, you know, experiencing lupus symptoms, I usually give a heads up to my manager and I say, hey, I'm going through this, and, you know, I need some time off, I need some flexibility, and usually it's like, no problem. And then, you know, if it becomes more of an issue, right, like I need a long period of leave, or I need this flexible schedule for the next 8 weeks. And then that's when, you know, I will go to HR and actually kind of go through that process. If you suspect at all that, you know, your manager is not a good place to go, is not going to be an ally for you, there's been hostility there previously, and it's not a person that you can trust, right? Then you go straight to HR. You don't have to go to your manager. It's just kind of you understanding the dynamics of your workplace, right? Because like you are the person that understands kind of the workplace best, the workplace that you're working in, the dynamics, and you want to approach this as a collaborative process. The law is designed to make these conversations a collaborative conversation, a collaborative process, to try to get you the support that you need and you're entitled to in order to do your job, right? And you take, I think that, you know, you take that approach in these conversations. And if it goes sideways, right, then there are things that you can do, be an advocate for yourself, like really, start documenting things. And it's not a bad idea from the beginning, like, when you're having these conversations, just to send like a confirming email, and put things in writing, but it doesn't have to be in a confrontational way, right? So and then going back to kind of whether you want to disclose your diagnosis of having lupus. Again, the law does not require it. The law does not require it. The law prohibits your employer from asking you for a diagnosis. So if there are HR forms and things like that that are asking you for your actual diagnosis, that's actually unlawful, right? They don't have a right to know what your diagnosis is. But maybe you do want to share, right? Because lupus, again, is one of those invisible disabilities that people might totally not understand. And what you can say about it is that it's chronic. It's a chronic autoimmune disorder, which means that, I'm going to have it for the rest of my life. And issues could crop up, right? It's not like you give me this accommodation now and like everything is fine, everything goes away. This is a situation where I'm having these symptoms now, I'm having a flare now, but you kind of provide notice to your employer to say, like, this could be an ongoing issue, or this could be, something that I may need accommodation for later on, so that, nobody is surprised that, look at what happened. I thought they were fine before, and now they have, another need for accommodation, right? Again, conversation. You're talking to human beings. It's really kind of trying to engender that sympathy, empathy, but also to try to assert your rights and provide some notice to your employer about what you might need, right? And then once you disclose, then the law encourages what's called an interactive process, right? So you've disclosed your need for accommodation, and then the law kind of encourages what's called this interactive process, where you and the company will go back and forth in terms of what accommodation makes most sense for you, right? And it's called a two-way street. It's actually like from the law itself, or from case law that's interpreting these laws to say, like, the obligation is on both sides. You and the company have an obligation to come together, have this dialogue to really figure out what's the best accommodation that makes sense for you. But it also has to be reasonable, right? That the word there is reasonable, meaning that the company is not entitled or obligated to give you anything you want. They have to go through this process to figure out, like, a cost benefit analysis, like what's the burden of it. And you're supposed to have a conversation and kind of figure out what is a reasonable accommodation, right? And so for lupus patients, that could be a flexible work schedule, right? You have doctor's appointments to make. Maybe, there's a lot of stiffness or pain in the morning, so you need to have a later start time. You're immunocompromised, right, because of all the drugs that we're taking. So maybe working from home makes sense, especially, this became very relevant in the time of COVID. Where the accommodation is that you're working from home, right? Or when there are group meetings or big meetings, you're meeting over Zoom. You're exempted from travel requirements, and allowing you to mask, right, in these situations. Maybe you need to take additional breaks. That's an accommodation. Maybe you need to have a chair available to you to be able to sit down, right? If this is a standing position, like a cashier or retail position. And leave, right? Leave is a form of an accommodation. Like if you need to take a few weeks to recover, there are a lot of leave laws, and that's like a whole nother session that kind of interact with each other. But for our purposes, it's important to keep in mind that leave is a form of accommodation, right? And I've kind of used all of these types of accommodations. And like lupus, it can be unexpected, these flares at times, right? And so it's important to As soon as you have any indication that you might need accommodation, that's the time to have conversations with, with your employer, and certainly, if you can, to kind of put the request in writing. Where does an employer's obligation kind of end to provide you with that accommodation? Again, that's where it causes them an undue hardship, right? That you have to kind of think about the cost and think about what additional resources they might need to provide that accommodation, and where it's excessive or no longer reasonable to expect them to do that, then they show that it's an undue hardship, right? Just give you a few examples. If you're on leave and if you keep extending that leave first to like 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, depending on the size of the employer, right? Maybe it's no longer a reasonable accommodation to accept that they're going to keep your job open after that length of leave. Or maybe like if you have the inability to travel for long periods of time, and that is an essential function of your job, and the employer then has to hire other people to be able to do the travel function of your job, right? Maybe that's an undue hardship for your employer, and then it makes sense to transfer you out, or even think about termination, right? I think I'll end with, and I'm going to get to the questions from the community in a minute, and just really encouraging you and making you understand that you should be an advocate for yourself, right? You can ask for the accommodations that you need. Doesn't always guarantee that you're going to get those accommodations, but talk to your doctor, right? Figure out like what makes sense for you in the workplace. And be an advocate for yourself, because the law is supporting you, right? And so you can do that. You can ask for what you need and ask for the accommodations that you need. And again, this doesn't mean that this process at all needs to be adversarial or confrontational, right? Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the questions that I've gotten from the community previously. So the first one is, I'm working as an independent contractor for a company. They're my sole source of income. Do I have the same rights under the law as an employee? Unfortunately, you do not have the same rights, in that the ADA and the FEHA only apply to employees in most circumstances. The one exception is that under the FEHA, you have the right to be free from harassment, even as an independent contractor. However, you don't have the same rights to reasonable accommodation. That said, that doesn't mean that you can't ask, right? If you have a relationship with this company, you have a good rapport, you've been working with them for a long time, they value you and the relationship they have with you, they probably will try to make it work. So, again, like, you can still be an advocate for yourself, you can still ask. Another note is that you may be misclassified, right? And if you're actually an employee that's misclassified as an independent contractor, then you have the same rights as any other employee. But that's a complicated legal question. And if you have a suspicion of misclassification, you need to reach out to an employment attorney. I got one question about how do company ESG scores affect employees with lupus? I have to confess, right? I'm not very familiar with ESG scores, but I suppose that you can kind of look up a company's scores for things like health and safety and access to healthcare to get some data points on whether it's a good place to work, but it's certainly not the end of the inquiry. The third question is, my job is requiring us to attend an all-hands meeting, all-hands team building event with 50 people inside with no mask. If they do not require a mask and I have lupus, am I required to be there legally if I'm immunocompromised? So the answer there is, you need an accommodation, right? Which is either to skip all hands or to be able to attend remotely. So that's something that you should disclose to your manager or HR and say something like, look, I have lupus, I have an autoimmune disease that makes me immunocompromised, puts my health at risk. If I attend these large meetings, can I attend remotely or be excused from participating? Question 4, I'm starting to look for work. Am I obligated to disclaim that I have lupus and fibromyalgia, right? Going back to what I said earlier, it really depends on your individual circumstances. If you have a need for accommodation, it might make sense to disclose. If you don't have a need at this point, maybe you go through the hiring process first, right? Where do you get, this is question number 5, where do you get a medical confirmation form, HR or the doctor? So with HR, we'll probably have some forms that they normally use for you to fill out, and then like a portion for your doctor to fill out. If they don't have those forms, you can just write an email saying, I need an accommodation. And your doctor, they have the right to ask for your doctor certification. And the only thing that your doctor certifies is what are your restrictions, right? Sometimes HR might send like the essential functions of your job and ask your doctor to say, what are your restrictions, and what are the requested accommodations, and can you, in their opinion, can you perform the essential functions of the job with those accommodations, right? And usually the answer is yes. When disclosing to my employer, is it enough to say I have a chronic autoimmune or more specific diagnosis? Again, not required to report your diagnosis, but there are circumstances where it might make sense to do so. When you're out or working modified days due to a lupus flare, are you still using your own personal sick leave? You can elect to do so, or your employer can require that you do so. But if it's not required, you don't have to. But keep in mind that that time then might be unpaid, right? Because all of the leave laws and depending on if you're beyond kind of the sick days that you're entitled to under state law, then that could be unpaid time if you don't use your own PTO. Has COVID changed the way you can ask for work exceptions or accommodations in large group settings if you have lupus or are on immunosuppressive drugs? So COVID has changed a lot, not in terms of the actual laws, but in the application of the laws, right? So we live in a world now where for the good part of the last 3 years, most people were working from home. Which means that most people were performing the essential functions of their jobs while working from home. So now there's a lot of employers that want employees back in the office, part-time, full-time. And, as lupus patients, we're immunocompromised or we're going through other things where working from home is a good accommodation. It's then hard for an employer to say, well, working in the office is an essential function of your job, right? Because for the last 3 years, I've been doing the same job working from home. So that, has changed the conversation a little bit, right? COVID and kind of what we saw was possible in terms of accommodations, and understanding the issue around immunocompromised people, right? Like we have our own category with the CDC and all the COVID regulations that come down. It's like, elderly people and like immunocompromised people. So I think like that has really brought immunocompromised, that like people as a category as being at risk, more into like a mainstream conversation. So I think those are the main 2 ways that COVID has changed things specifically for lupus patients. Okay, can a reasonable accommodation be wearing a mask in meetings if the office is no longer masked? Yes, absolutely, for yourself, right? They really don't have an obligation to like require everybody else to wear masks. Because that's no longer, that's no longer an obligation in city, state, local, federal law. They can be nice and ask other people to do it, but not legally required. But they still have to accommodate you and provide you with like remote access to participate in the meeting or excuse you from being at that meeting. Another question is, my daughter is starting an internship. Should she let them know about her autoimmune disease? Again, right? You kind of, it depends on the circumstances. The last question is, if I think I'm being discriminated against by my manager for needing accommodations for a lupus flare, what steps should I take to report it without receiving backlash? And that's a great question. And again, that's like, another topic for another session. But you want to take a look at your employee handbook, figure out how to report it. If you have HR, right, that's a good place to go. if there's another manager you can trust, maybe that's a place where you can raise it. Ultimately, you want to take some steps to protect yourself, and going to HR is a good option. Putting things in writing is a good option. And the second part about doing it, without receiving backlash is a harder question, because retaliation is very much prohibited under the law, but that doesn't mean that people aren't going to retaliate against you, right? That doesn't mean that raising this, escalating these issues doesn't put a target on your back. Because I see the ugly side of things when people, stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves. But I think where you start with is just having a conversation, going to HR, letting them know about these issues. The law is really designed to, to give employers an opportunity to do the right thing, and they can't do that until they get notice of something that's wrong. So that's your first step. And then if things continue to go sideways, then you probably should reach out to an employment lawyer, right? And I think that Brianna has shared my bio and my contact information. If anything comes up, any questions related to these issues, you're always welcome to use me as a resource, and just reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much for having me.